being in the Port Authority Police is one of these careers, I think, that I could have never dreamed of being in an agency that was so open to change. August of 1967 is when I graduated from the police academy.
What made you choose the PAPD?
Well, let me go back. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, actually. After college, a lot of my friends were going into police work. I really was doing substitute school teaching for a while and really didn't know what I wanted to do, to be honest about it. And I tried a couple other things. I did mechanical drafting and those kinds of things. But my friends that were going into law enforcement sort of convinced me maybe it's something I'd like to do, because I like people, always have. And I interfaced with the police when I was growing up because I was in the PAL, if you remember the old PALs. And so I said to myself, let me take some exams. And I took exams for the New York City Police Department, the New Jersey State Police, the New York State Police, and guess what? The Port Authority Police. And interestingly enough, I didn't know much about the Port Authority Police, and very few of my friends had taken tests for the Port Authority Police. And most of those that ended up in policing ended up either in the Newark Police Department or the New York City Police Department. But the first of all those agencies I just talked about, Port Authority Police called me. So I said, why not? I didn't know much about the Port Authority Police, even though I had heard about them. But my view of what the Port Authority Police was that they were the police at the tunnels and the bridges. And basically that was it. And the bus terminal. Yeah, I should say that, but I didn't know much more about the Port Authority Police. I knew that they were at the airports, but I really didn't know significantly what they did at the airports.
So there was a shift now, though. In at that time, the PAPD had stopped taking tolls. There was that change had happened around the period of time you were coming onto the force.
Yes, in fact, when I came on the force, we were the first class not to take tolls anymore. We went directly into the river crossings. In fact, my first assignment was at the Lincoln Tunnel, and I worked on the midnight shift. What was interesting, once I got into being on patrol and so on and so forth, I learned a lot more, because that's when I found out too that we had a significant contingent at the airports. But even then, I didn't learn one of the most significant things. I think that most of my friends and colleagues didn't know at all, that the Port Authority Police were really dual police officers. And in fact, I would say they epitomized public safety because they were also the firefighters at the airports. They were the aircraft fire and rescue people at the airports, which was sort of something that I don't think most people that lived in the Port District even knew that. That was intriguing to me.
So when you start in the department, there weren't many people that looked like you at that time. Would that be correct? There was not a lot of diversity in the force.
Absolutely not. In fact, in my graduating class, I think there may have been about 60 of us. I think there was maybe 2 or 3 African Americans. There was 1 Hispanic. There were no women, no Asians, and nobody else that I could figure out that was a minority. So no, there were not that many. It was not a diverse agency, as I could see. But that was okay.
Well, to put in perspective to a lot of the younger folks who will be watching this, 1967, when you start, is also the year that Newark erupts.
Well, that's a whole nother story of my experiences. In fact, one of my very, very first interesting and troubling experience was this. When those riots erupted in Newark, Port Authority Police, given the fact that we had a large contingent of police officers, in fact, the numbers of people in the Port Authority Police we were larger than the Newark Police Department, which was the largest police department actually in the state of New Jersey at the time. And several of my friends were on the Newark Police Department, as I mentioned, that had gone to school with me. And in fact, one person, Hubert Williams, ended up as the first Black police director in Newark. A few years later, he was appointed by the first Black mayor, Kenneth Gibson. But anyhow, the Port Authority police at the time, during the riots, was called to supplement the Newark Police Department and the New Jersey State Police and the National Guard patrolling the streets of Newark when parts of the city were burning down. I remember being out on Springfield Avenue where I used to go and my parents used to go to shop, and the place was on fire. And unfortunately, I happened to see people in the streets doing what they shouldn't have been doing, throwing Molotov cocktails, etc., that I happened to know. They were younger than me, but I knew them from the city, and that was troubling. The good thing was nobody got killed, that I remember, but we arrested a lot of people. But again, I say it was personally traumatic for me to see parts of the city that I grew up in burning down.
How did that shape you when you look at the arc of your career? And we'll talk more about the arc of your career, but you become active on the force during a very intense period of civil unrest across the nation, a lot of hostility to policing across the nation, regardless of whether people were minorities, because there was also the protesting against the war in Vietnam. There was a lot of stuff going on in the 60s. So how do you feel that shaped you as first as a cop on the beat, but then later it's certainly in high levels of leadership, that your first sort of experiences really policing in that first rookie time was so challenging?
Well, let's talk about, and let me just move a little bit past the riots themselves. And I remember when the Kerner Commission came out with their report after the riots across the United States. It wasn't just about Newark, Detroit, Los Angeles. We could go on and on. And if you read the Kerner Commission report, it's centered on, and this is almost prophetic, what's going on 50 years later, but it's centered on the separation and the tension between communities, especially communities not just of color, but poor communities, and the police that supposedly was serving these communities. And it also centered on the fact that why is it that it seems that people in these communities have such, and I don't want to say hatred, but feel that that they're not treated fairly. So I also said to myself, well, as I look at the Port Authority Police itself, and I look at other police agencies, including Newark and those that I knew, New York City Police Department, there aren't that many people that look like me in these police departments that I know of. New Jersey State Police, New York State Police, those agencies that I took tests for. So I said to myself, well, I'm inside now. And one of the best ways to change things that the Kerner Commission said in their report is people like me need to get inside and see if we can change an institution like policing from the inside. And we can identify perhaps with those communities that we serve, but we can also change the culture. And I think even today you hear people talking about changing the culture of policing and culture of the criminal justice system. So I thought I was at the onset, being inside the Port Authority Police, and also knowing that there was so few of us in my class. And when I got out then within the department, I could see there was very few of us in the agency itself. Maybe this is a seminal time for a person like me, and I've always had a personality that I like to make change, that maybe I can change from within. So that started me on my journey. because if you're going to make change, you have to move up the ranks to become a leader.
Now, my understanding is you were, and I assume probably still are if you were taking them, a great test taker. You aced the exams as you sought promotions, but the promotions didn't necessarily follow with great speed. Can you talk a little about how that process worked? Because there's a process of exams to move to, I guess, sergeant and lieutenant and work your way up the ranks.
Well, Port Authority Police, unlike a lot of police agencies, were not civil service, and they're still not civil service. So there was a lot of flexibility in doing promotions. But I won't go into those details. But the first sergeant's test I took was after about 2.5 years in the department. Now, you have to remember this too. I was #1 academically in my recruit class too. I ended up as the #1 student. So I thought, okay, the world is an oyster. I'm going to do okay because, again, I am a good test taker. And I came out #1 on my first sergeant's list. Some people were surprised, I think. But anyhow, I didn't get promoted, but I really didn't feel that bad. I said, well, hey, I'm still young, not necessarily chronologically young, because I was one of the oldest recruits in the class. I was 27 years old when I joined the Port Authority Police. But that was okay, because the people that were promoted to sergeant before me had a lot of time on the job. So they had a lot more practical experience, and I understood that. 2 years later, there was another sergeant's test. Guess what? I was #1 again. But I was getting a little frustrated now because, again, they promoted people that had a lot more experience. I didn't care. Third test comes, I'm #1 again. And this is the time that was a decision-making time for me, because now I had over 6 years in the department, and they promoted somebody that had less time than me. I'm not going to go into the details, but that was a point where I said, no, this can't continue. I need to do something. And I asked a lot of questions of the hierarchy and so on and so forth. And interesting, as a side note, the person that was the commanding officer of the police academy at the time, a very, very beautiful person, really. And he was sort of a mentor, because when I graduated, he said to me, Henry, you're going to go far in this department, because I can see that in your attitude and your desire to go through the ranks. His name was Rakowski, was his last name. And I mean, I always say to people, there's always somebody that can help you. They reach back and they encourage you. Anyhow, I became frustrated. So I said to my family too, I said, I got to do something. And if you recall, back in those days, the federal government, and this was part of, I think, after the Kerner Commission, they had formed a department called EEOC, Equal Opportunity Commission. And I decided to file a class action lawsuit against the Port Authority, that their promotion system was unfair, and also their hiring system was unfair. Because after all those years that I was still there, 6 years or so, there was still, I didn't see too many people like me again, Latinos, no Asians, and big thing, no women. There was still no women in the Port Authority Police. And this is, I think, like 1972, 73. But we were not, I don't want to put it on the Port Authority Police. The first women police that were hired in the New York City Police Department, it's like 1973, 1974. So we were all about the same. The New Jersey State Police, I don't know when the first women they hired. So we were not unusual. Policing was not unusual. It took a long time. But anyhow, fast forward, the people from EEOC came up and met with the people in the Port Authority. And we all agreed. And I said, I don't want any money. All I want you to do is develop a promotion system that will make it a little fairer for people to get promoted. And beyond that, let's take a look at our hiring practices and see if we can hire more minorities and women. Port Authority agreed. I got promoted to sergeant, but they also said, okay, Henry, we want you to help us. So we want you to go out and see if you can recruit more qualified minorities to join the Port Authority Police. And I raised my hand and I said, sure. So I went to a lot of the historically Black colleges, and I was able to recruit people because they didn't know anything about the Port Authority Police. And I think I was a good salesperson because I learned a lot. And I learned a lot of things that I didn't realize. And that became almost, I became a one-man PR organization about the Port Authority Police because we were a hidden secret. And I found out that we were the only police agency in the United States of America that policed every single mode of transportation. Listen to what I'm saying. And we still are. We still are. And we do it better than anybody else. I know I'm sounding like a PR person, but we are. And that's one of the things that has really energized me over the years. And even after all these years, when I talk about the Port Authority Police, I get lit up. Here's another thing about the Port Authority Police. We, over the years, I think we epitomized this phrase of community-oriented policing. We are really committed to the community that we serve. And so many of the things that we do really focus in on our own community as guardians, not necessarily soldiers and looking to arrest people.
Well, that's an interesting phrase, the guardians. One of the programs, a little, I think, further in your career, came out of the bus terminal that was at one point a very unsavory part of New York City, not just the bus terminal. And it dealt with working with, I believe, working with social workers and runaways that were coming in. Can you talk a little bit about that program and how you were involved in it and what it, because I think it epitomizes the guardianship you talk about.
Absolutely. I was a sergeant at the time assigned to the bus terminal. And I forgot the name of the two plainclothes police officers that really used to do a lot of patrols having to do with what was going on in Times Square, 42nd Street, 8th Avenue, and so on and so forth. And it was very different to what it is today. There was strip clubs all around, there was pawn shops all around, and it needed to change. But the bus terminal, given the fact it's the largest bus terminal in the world and the largest one in the United States, young kids used to come from all over the United States that were running away from home, running away from bad situations at home, and they would gravitate to the bus terminal. In fact, that area was called the Minnesota Strip because so many kids came from the West and a lot of them from Minnesota on buses. But this is what's the problem that used to happen. They'd get off the bus and pimps would be waiting for these young kids, both girls and boys, and take them out onto the street to prostitute themselves. In fact, we called them, there was a slang name called chicken hawks. And we saw what was going on, and we came up with a program. And I was a sergeant there, and some of the cops. And again, see, this goes back to the attitude of the police and the Port Authority Police as guardians and as helpers. They were concerned that what we were doing was we were arresting these young kids. I'm talking about 13, 14 years old. For what? Putting them into the criminal justice system? It didn't make any sense. How could we at least steer these kids into the right direction and also arrest the pimps and the people that were preying on them? So we came up with the idea, it was a group of us, and said, why don't we see if we can reach out to the superstructure, the Port Authority, and convince the people there, could we hire some social workers to be at the bus terminal, so when we get these young girls, they go into a separate office and they counsel them and steer them at least into social programs. The first program of its kind in the United States of America that paired social workers with police officers. So it was an intervention before these kids hit the criminal justice system. And isn't it interesting today that we're talking about police and how do you intervene into situations where people even have mental health issues and so on and so forth, and you get away from arresting people and you try, I mean, homeless people, just because they're homeless shouldn't be arrested. They should be taken into situations where they can be helped. And what happened was, because our system that we were doing at the bus terminal was so successful, the superintendent at the time asked me to come down to headquarters and apply for a LEAA grant. LEAA, the Law Enforcement Administration, was giving out grants for special programs to police departments. We wrote it up, sent it down, and guess what? It became a model program for policing across the United States. And this goes way, way, way back to the 70s. So that's
another hidden secret.
That's right. And it became a model program, and it's it's continued to today. But it's one of these things that the Port Authority Police was on the cutting edge of how you change policing in general. And I mean, it shows you, it was a model program, and the federal government was really enamored with what, and so they funded it for a few years before the federal money ran out, and the Port Authority has funded it ever since.
Well, to sort of fast forward a little, how do you go from a sergeant at the bus terminal to eventually the first Black superintendent of police? Can you kind of briefly talk about how that journey happens? Because my understanding, the next promotion wasn't necessarily as easy as the first promotion. You're constantly fighting against a culture that isn't changing quickly enough.
Well, I'm an impatient person, but I will say this. Even though I'm impatient, when I took my first lieutenant's test, even though I'd been a sergeant for a couple of 3 years, I think what helped me too was because I'd gone down to headquarters and I had developed a grant for the bus terminal program. I also was able to get some more federal money for a driver training program with driver simulators. And I did some other things to bring in some federal money that helped offset the budget. So the superintendent of police loved what I was doing, because he always said to me when I was there, Degeneste, as long as you can pay for your salary with these grants, you can stay down here until the next lieutenant's test. So when I took the next lieutenant's test, lo and behold, I was #1 again. And it wasn't too much longer, a couple of 3 years that I was promoted. And so that was good. After that, I took the captain's exam. And a few years later, I was promoted to captain. And what was really interesting then too, there was major change taking place in the demographics in the Port Authority Police. When I became a captain, they brought on the first females. That was an outstanding class of females too. I mean, their backgrounds were unbelievable. A lot of women who had been nurses, RNs, and so on and so forth. I remember one young lady, she had been in the Israeli army, and she was also a nurse. And she came to the United States and did whatever she did in nursing, and then was in the first or second class of females. And many of those females rose up through the ranks during the end of my career. But since then, I mean, it's been amazing because I've followed the Port Authority Police and the rise of females, the rise of minorities, and the numbers. Just to reflect back, I was talking to somebody recently, and 30% of the last recruit class were minorities. Isn't that remarkable? From maybe what I experienced, maybe 1 or 2%. That is remarkable. And I'll take some of that credit.
Well, we'll let you. So how do you go from captain to superintendent?
That's interesting. Okay. I happened to be, and when I was a captain, this wasn't my first assignment. I had been assigned to Kennedy Airport as the operations captain, and we can go through some of the stuff that I experienced when I was at Kennedy as the operations captain. But I was at LaGuardia Airport, and I was commanding officer there. And unfortunately, at the time, the superintendent of police, Walter Lee, who was really a good person, I mean, and he sort of mentored me too, because he's the one that brought me down to headquarters as a sergeant. He passed away. And the deputy superintendent, who I don't remember, his name may have been Riley, but he retired. So the two top spots were open in the Port Authority Police. Unprecedented. And at the time, and this was in 1979, I believe, something like that. But anytime, I'm going to digress a bit. This was a couple of, or 3 years after the executive director, Peter Goldmark, had come. And for some reason, I had met him on many occasions, and especially when I was at LaGuardia, because he would take the shuttle down to Washington, D.C. quite a bit, and he would talk to me and so on and so on, because I'm a talkative person. And so is Mr. Goldmark. We've become real friends since then, Peter. But anyhow, the two spots open up. And he probably doesn't even remember this, but he had called me and asked me, well, Hank, are you going to put your hat in the ring for the superintendent's job? I go, Peter, well, yeah, I'm the youngest of all the captains. I'm the only minority captain. And I know you're going out on a nationwide search. I may not have a shot at it. So when I said I'm the youngest, I think that sort of clicked with him, because he and I are only 3 months apart in age. And he was the youngest executive director ever in the Port Authority too. So he said, hey, Hank, throw your hat in the ring. I did. The rest basically is almost history, because everybody went through the process, including people that I had worked for within the Port Authority Police in the superstructure and the hierarchy. Inspectors, deputy inspectors, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out that in the final analysis, and they had like an internal board of directors and so on, Peter was one, they made their selection. And they were filling both slots, superintendent and deputy superintendent. And I get called, and I said, oh, I guess I didn't make it. I thought I did well. Let me put it that way. I thought I did well on the interviews and all of that. But when I get the call, and I believe it was from Peter. I believe it was from Peter. He said, Hank, we made our selection. And I said, okay. And he said, well, we decided to select John Giovanni as superintendent of police. And I knew John. John was an inspector at the time, very smart. Had a lot of time. I think he had like 28 years in the department, 30 years, very senior. And he mentored me in some things, so great. And he said, but we've selected you as the deputy superintendent. And let me tell you, I'm not going to say I almost fainted, but I was shocked. I really was shocked. Anyhow, I go to headquarters, and now I'm doing my thing. And you see, I'm a workaholic. And I remember going down to headquarters, and some of the people that were there, of course, were people that I had worked for. And there was a little bit of tension. But one of the things, again, I'm a workaholic, and I would come in the mornings, even before the superintendent. I'd come in at 6:30 in the morning, and I'd stay there till 6 at night, because I love to read and I love to absorb stuff. And I remember people used to say, what does he think he's doing? You know, he's trying to outwork us all. But people that knew me knew I worked a long time. Anyhow, I'm going to fast forward a year later, and this was in 1982. I happened to be in England, and I was talking actually to the Metropolitan Police and Scotland Yard about, if you recall, in London, in 1982, I believe it was, there was riots, race riots in a place they call Brixton. And I had written a lot of pieces. I had written editorial comments, and I like to write, and I was writing stuff about those riots. And I was also an instructor, an adjunct instructor at John Jay College in criminal justice. And also, how do you deal with integrating police agencies in the United States? So they had asked me to come over to England to talk to them about if I could help them sort of integrate the police system in the UK. It just surprised to me that they even saw some of the things I wrote. So I was over there a couple of times. And then I get this call from Terry Potente, actually, Peter's assistant. She said, Hank, Peter needs you to come back to the US. And I said, well, I'm over here now. This is my third time. I'm up at the Police Command College, and I'm giving a lecture to senior leaders. You've got to come back. You're not going to tell me why? You got to come back. So I come back. And I come into Peter's office, and he says, Hank, and I think he even saluted me. And he says, I have something to give you. And he says, you're the new superintendent of police. And I was shocked. And at the time, I ended up as the youngest ever superintendent of police. I was only 42 years old and the first minority. And that was really the culmination, really, of my rise through the ranks. And I did it in I think it was 14 years. So that was interesting. And I have to thank a lot of my mentors on the way up that reached out and helped me. And I really have to say that Peter was what should I say? He was prophetic, because he told me, he says, I knew you'd be able to do it. Now, he told me this though, and this may even embarrass him when you speak to him, if you do. He said to me, I know that when you go back to headquarters, people are going to say, perhaps, that you got it through affirmative action. He says, and you know better than that. He said, you're very smart, you're very aggressive, you know how to absorb a lot of information, and you are a change agent. And I can see that you want to make a lot of change in this department, that is change is needed, and I'm counting on you. And he said, so you know it's because you deserve it. And I said, yeah, Peter. I said, but you know this affirmative action thing, so many people like me, you get tagged with that. And you just have to let it roll off your back, and you put your nose to the grindstone and work. That's all.
What would be one or two of the changes that you helped bring about when you were superintendent that you feel most proud about?
Well, let's talk first of all about certain things. Again, here we go about the hidden gems in the Port Authority Police that make us so different. Okay, one of the things we didn't have in the Port Authority Police when we were patrolling the path system. I had talked to people, actually, there was a fellow who was one of the directors in the Port Authority Police, named Lou Gambaccini. You may have heard that name. But Lou ended up too as the head of SEPTA in Philadelphia. And I remember talking to Lou, because I had heard in some of my readings with people about law enforcement that they had canine patrols in the system down there, the rail system. And I said, Lou, you know, it would really be interesting if we put canines in our path system, because I said they're good for crowd control and so on and so forth. And they would also help officers if something happened and they had to go into the system on the tracks. We can train the dogs to hunt people. If people get into the tracks, we had a problem there. Sometimes you get homeless people that would go into the subway system, especially once it was going into, and hide in there, just like they did in the New York City transit system. And guess what? New York City didn't have canines. He said, this is the kind of stuff you need to do. So we instituted the first canine patrol system in PATH, before even New York City subways did that. The Transit Authority Police, because at that time they were called the Transit Authority Police. I'm very proud of that. Another thing we did, and this I remember because in PATH they had a fire in the system in 1982. And our cops were down there. They rescued folks and so on and so forth. But it was, it was a difficult thing. Good thing is nobody died in that fire, but it was traumatic. And some of the officers talked to me and said to me, "Hey, boss, we need to really do." And I said, we need to do, because we didn't have it at the time. We need to start an emergency services unit that deals with these kinds of. So the guys are highly trained in hazardous material, in rescue stuff having to do with the rail transportation system, with bridge rescues, jumpers, and all those things, with dealing with structural fires. They really need to be focused, and their training needs to be in emergency rescue. So in 1983, I believe it was, we developed our ESU unit, they call now. And guess what? It's one of the best ES units in the metropolitan area. And it goes and helps other agencies in the Port District because they're so good at what they do. That's another thing I'm proud of. Now I'm going to turn something different. And again, as I said, we are involved in a form of community-oriented policing. And my oldest daughter, when she was growing up, she always wanted to be a special ed teacher and so on and so forth. She ended up in college doing all of that stuff and so on and so forth. But she got me involved in Special Olympics when she was a teenager. And I was talking to a young man. In fact, he ended up as, when he retired, he was a chief. But his name is Bob Belfiore, and he was a sergeant. And I said, Bob, I would really like to see if we as an agency could get involved in Special Olympics. I said, that would really do a lot to enhance our community orientation in policing, because police sometimes seem to be so staid and they don't do all these things that are really out of their wheelhouse. And he says, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you know what? They're going to have a torch run in Los Angeles for the 1984 Olympics. And you know what? Maybe I can contact Bill Bradley, who at the time was a U.S. Senator. But guess what? He was also a New York Knick and all that stuff, and he was an athlete. And see if we could get him when the torch comes from Europe. I understand it's coming to New Jersey, and then they're going to take that torch all the way across the United States to Los Angeles. And my idea is, why don't we in the Port Authority Police touch a lot of the departments all around New Jersey? Because I understand the Kennedys are having the Special Olympics at Rutgers University this year. He said, wow, he said, that's a lot to do. Long story short, we were able to get the torch from Senator Bradley, and we started running. I'd laugh about this because we started running the torch at about 5 a.m. at Liberty State Park in Jersey City. And we ended up contacting other and handing off the torch. And I was the first guy to run the torch. But anyhow, we handed it off and we ended up at Rutgers University. But because we hadn't practiced before, we were like 4 hours early before the start of the games. And now, fast forward, the Port Authority Police, and I have to credit Chief Belfiore now, have run the most successful law enforcement torch runs in the world. And he became the head of the police Olympic torch run worldwide. And I think last year or the year before, they raised like $2 or $3 million for Special Olympics. That's something that even still sends a chill through my mind. The Kennedys always talked about the Port Authority Police and what they were able to do for Special Olympics. And now there's torch runs, law enforcement torch runs all over the United States. but we're the ones that did it. So that's something you see that you don't think about police, but that's police and community showing that we care.
Any last thoughts from your perspective now? You've been away from the agency more than 30 years, which is a long time. What would you, if you could see yourself back when you're, back in 1967, if Henry today could talk to Henry then, and you had like 2 sentences, what would you tell him?
Boy, that's an interesting.
With regard to being in the PAPD, of course.
Yeah. No, I understand. I would say this again, because I didn't know anything about the Port Authority Police. You don't know what you don't know. That's number one. And so because I didn't know anything, and even though they called me first, somebody told me who I knew that was in a high-ranking position in NYPD, because I was still in the police academy of the Port Authority and I got called by NYPD. And this person told me this. And I said, well, should I come over there? And he says, you know what? You're better off being a small fish in that pond than a minnow in the ocean. He says, you stay right there, because that isn't, and this person didn't know much about the Port Authority Police, but he says, it's an interesting agency that most people don't talk about. And maybe, Henry, when you get there, you can make a difference.
And you did.
Well, I hope, just let me say this too, and I will say this, even though I've had several careers since then, policing now, because of the Port Authority Police, is in my DNA. It's in my DNA. During that time, I was one of the founders of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. I was their 5th national president. And today, I'm the vice chairman of an organization that was founded 50 years ago as a result of the Kerner Commission, the National Police Foundation, which is the largest research organization that researches areas of policing and how to improve it. So policing is in my DNA, and you know why? Because of the Port Authority Police. We're unique, and we're the best.